welcome to our 3 o'clock panel session. So I'm going to welcome my panelists in a second, so Kevin, Izzy and Tim. Before we do that, let me just introduce the session. So this is about creating a sustainable food future and strengthening supply chain resilience. So whether or not you work in this sector, let's assume everybody likes to eat and drink, and we want to continue doing so for a few years to come. So let's see if we can make it a more resilient and sustainable system. So what we're here to do today is really we don't have all the answers, we have some, but these guys are going to share a wealth of learnings and experiences in the hope that you can take away a couple that will help you to drive more action within your own organisations. But feel free to ask lots of questions. There is a roving mic, and make sure that you get out of this session what you want to find out. Otherwise, we're just here speaking into a void. So let's get started. First of all, intros. I'm Jen Emerton. I'm Head of Business Engagement at WRAP. And if you don't know us, we are a global environmental action NGO. We convene a whole bunch of different stakeholders, from government to business to philanthropic to academic, and really try and convene programs of work that enable businesses to take collective action across the food system. Thanks, Kevin. Across the food system, across packaging, and within textiles. And I'm really excited at the amount of action that the businesses we work with have taken. And you can just see, although it's very challenging when you try and do things together, it's how you can achieve significantly more impact than doing it alone. So that's a bit about us and me. Right, Kevin, do you want to do a quick intro and tell us a bit about where nature sits within your role?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I'm Kevin Watson. I'm Sustainability Director for Levy. And you don't know Levy, we're part of Compass Group, so the largest food service provider globally. Part of the problem, but definitely part of the solution as well. Within our sector, covering UK and Europe, I have oversight over 81 venues. We feed about between 15 and 17 million people a year. We pour about...
Including this one, right?
Including this one. There's other things like you will have heard, Wimbledon, Twickenham, Johan Cruyff Arena, Aviva in Dublin, Uber Arena Berlin, so on and so forth. So a large bit there. But you asked me about nature, and I think we have been quite environment focused over the last kind of 3-4 years, looking at those levers as like most people are. And people ask me nowadays saying, where do you sit on that? And I think inadvertently, all levers work with each other. So we'll get into some of the examples later. But as you drive down environment and put more environmental interventions in their place, so like reducing meat proteins, ultimately you're reducing, say, cattle or poultry, which, in turn, you're supporting then maybe more regenerative farming. So you're supporting on nature in there. Good conversation yesterday in the Conduit as part of their health conversation yesterday. So at the same time, we were putting more beans and pulses in. So we were looking at the building the health in our kind of menu formulation. So we've been doing a lot. I think, I've been in role 4 years. We published our first impact report in September. We've seen about an overall 30% reduction across our scope 3. I think, you can either celebrate that or feel the doom and gloom because you didn't hit the marker where somebody said that's what good looked like. So I think
you need a bit of both, though, right? A bit of celebration on progress.
Definitely celebration. We have 4,000 full-time employees and 33,000 casual employees or variable employees, so we all sit on the Levy books within our Constellation platform. So we are the UK's largest single hospitality workforce provider as well. So it takes a time to drive the education, which drives your culture, which makes these changes. But back to the nature, I think I have responsibility across all three, which is about environmental, health, nature, the levers that work against all of those, and then I suppose over top of that, a lot of social value and impact as well.
Thank you. We'll get into lots of those examples shortly. Izzy?
Thanks, Jen. So hi everyone, I'm Izzy. I'm the Sustainability Manager at Asahi UK. For those of you who don't know Asahi,
Anybody? Has anyone
anybody?
never heard of Asahi?
Put your hand up if you know Asahi. Have you?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I think
Well,
you're safe.
we're a global beverages company, so in the UK, we own some of the brands that hopefully you know and love, like Asahi Superdry, Peroni, and then also Fuller's London Pride, Meantime and Darkstar, which come out of the Griffin Brewery in Chiswick. In terms of nature, I'd say, I think aligned with what Kevin was saying, kind of addressing these environmental and social priorities together is increasingly important, and I think nature is becoming a much more central part of that. If you look at our supply chain in particular, it's a lot more simple than, say, a food company. You know, our main ingredients for beer are malted barley and hops, and for cider it's apples and sugar, so there's only 4. But I think that helps us kind of focus and pinpoint on what's important for each. And, you know, if we look at hops, for example, last year, with the hot weather in the late spring, early summer, hop yields were down 50 to 60% in some regions in the UK. And if we look at, say, apples, for them as a crop, pollination and nature and biodiversity is a crucial part of that process of farming that product. And we wouldn't have apples without it. So I think it's increasingly important to think about, you know, the action that we take for sustainability as a whole, not only with a focus on carbon emissions, but with a focus on these objectives in an intertwined way.
Thanks. And finally, Tim?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I was just reflecting as I was listening to the really rich stories from these guys. I think underpinning all of this is, or helping these processes is technology. So we have a rich background in starting out actually in food and critical infrastructure, food traceability, pharmaceuticals, and using technology to really understand all the way down to the tier N, the source of where food and goods come from. And I think we're seeing a huge trend now that all organizations are trying to get a much better handle on their tier N, you know, all the chain of the supply chain. Why? Because better data, better understanding means you can make those necessary improvements to be proactive about how you're reducing your scope 3, how you're ensuring resilience within your supply chains, and how you're managing risk. And let's face it, when you're dealing with something as critical as food and the food supply chain, there's probably nothing more important than that. If the supply chains are restricted or they have a cataclysmic event, then we don't get food into the country. So we're really proud to be supporting many significant businesses in this country, across Europe, with the technology, the data and the visibility and the transparency of what's happening in their supply chain, so they can take proactive measures to ensure we keep things moving.
And for those, because that might be, Osapiens might be an organisation that the audience don't know. Do you want to tell us a bit about the business in itself?
Okay, yeah, I'll give you the short story, because the story is always better than just talking about the technology. One of those rare things, a German green tech unicorn. Unicorn in technology terms meaning $1 billion valuation and all that stuff. But it started out with a vision 8 years ago that how can we make a social impact with technology that reaches all corners of the globe, and that was literally the vision. And fast forward to today, we have 2,500 enterprise customers, several million suppliers using our AI-powered portal to help them stay on top of compliance, regulation. Yes, that's the kind of needs to do stuff which has a positive intent behind it for sure, but also how to better cooperate together as a community up and down the supply chain, all the way through to the downstream customers themselves, to perform better. So the purpose is to really be a part of supporting the world to make a positive impact on improving the climatic events and to be predictive. So I'll just mention very briefly the role of AI. AI is many things, and we can debate that a lot. It's not going away. But where we see AI helping the cause is accelerating a lot of the information and data and predictive elements to help against climatic events, against geopolitical issues, the impact of tariffs and things like this, which again probably aren't going away at the moment, at least. Again, just to support businesses like these guys who are producing phenomenal outcomes, whether it's service outcomes or actual the products themselves. So yeah.
Can it predict our next Prime Minister?
It's not, well, it's seven in the last, it's not that quick. It's not that quick.
Okay, so what I thought we'd start with is this sense that nature is certainly gaining a lot of traction and rising up the agenda. And we are moving, I think, slowly but surely on from what we're calling out maybe a carbon tunnel vision. And I think quite rightly, for the past few years, we, and I mean everybody in sustainability, has had to focus on decarbonisation, and we've made some great progress on energy, on transport, on a whole range of different things. But actually now is the time to move on to maybe a bit more of a holistic framework in looking at our impact. And I think nature gives us that wider picture. So, Izzy, you talked in your intro about crop failure. Now, obviously, no amount of decarbonisation will stop that because it's reliant on weather and soil health and all of those things. So, how do you measure that? How have you moved from that carbon tunnel vision into a broader, holistic view?
That's a great question. I wonder if, so as I said at the start, I think we've kind of looked at each of our ingredients separately, and probably the best example of this is when we think about hops. So if you look at them from a pure Scope 3 emissions point of view, the quantity of hops that we use in beer is relatively small. Think of them as like the flavouring where the malted barley is the main volume that goes into producing that product. So in terms of emissions, it's a relatively small part of your Scope 3, but if you look at it from a climate and a nature risk point of view, it's really high. And that's because as a crop, they're both incredibly local, so the hops that you grow in the UK are different to the hops that are grown in Germany or in the US, and they all bring different flavours that are specific to those regions and climates. And also they're incredibly sensitive to changing weather patterns, changing rainfall, but not only climate impacts, but also nature-related impacts like the soil structure not being ready to deal with drought conditions, there being a decrease in natural pest predators, there being increasing vulnerability to diseases like verticillium wilt, which is a fungal disease that hops are specifically susceptible to. So I think if you look at it as a kind of climate and nature holistic picture, you see that actually it's a really vital part of our supply chain that's under threat. And I think kind of tying that all together, I guess it's really informed the approach that we've taken. So versus other parts of our supply chain like barley, where we've been working with farmers on regenerative practices, for hops actually we focus a lot more on research and innovation, in particular to make sure that we're taking action to try and increase resilience and preserve British hop varieties, which we use in our beers that are brewed at Griffin and Chiswick, but also that we're researching new varieties, supporting the ecosystem to research new varieties to mimic those flavours in the future. So we've been collaborating for the last couple of years with several other actors, so the British Hop Foundation, Charles Barron, one of our suppliers, and a couple of universities, the Royal Agricultural University and Warwick Uni as well, to support a couple of hops PhD studies, one which looks at using biochar on the soil to improve resilience, and the other which is looking at planting wildflowers in the alleys between hops. So if you don't know, hops are a kind of a climbing plant, so they grow on vines and they grow vertically in alleys. So be looking at planting wildflowers in between the alleys in order to improve the biodiversity in the field. And this has kind of spurred also some other research that's been driven by the other actors that we're working with. And I think the research itself, really encapsulates this like combined agendas approach, because it's not the purpose of the research isn't to reduce emissions, it's to improve resilience in that system in order to kind of stand it up and help us make beer in the future.
So dare I ask, was that a relatively straightforward business case, if it's quite a clear, resilient story for that particular ingredient?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I guess it's quite a different kind of investment, versus the other kind of decisions we make, which might be, thinking about decarbonising our brewery and investing in technology and the number of years that it would pay off. Is a very different pathway to support. But I think following on from, starting from that point of a few years ago when we're looking at doing a kind of climate risk and a nature risk assessment and seeing the implications of that for our business, I think that helps provide the justification for the investment.
Thanks. Let's come back to some of the sort of levers and enablers that have helped you get there. Kevin, for Levy, is it the same, or do you still feel like you're in carbon tunnel vision? You talked about a framework. What's that balance for your business?
Yeah, I think let's give an example. When we had our kind of pre-catch-up, I'll give a kind of an internal, something we do within one of our operations. I'll talk about Brentford, but actually this example is live all the way from Burnley, Huddersfield, Aston Villa, all the way down the country. And we get to work with great brewers. So I've been out and I've spent a lot of time with the likes of Diageo and Asahi to understand what they're doing. But one of our big levers we've pulled this year is we put a campaign out in November called Beef Out, Venison In. And don't get me before, if there's anybody from the NFU here or the kind of British farming community, I'm completely comfortable with that because it's all about finding a balance. Like over the last 4 years, we've pushed all of our supply chain to UK. Within the UK, so it's in-country sourcing, like looking at the welfare of the animal, the sourcing standards, so on and so forth, and really proud that we now have that 100% British supply chain when it comes to meat proteins. But when we look at that at the same time, and wild venison, for example, and the environmental damage that they're doing, and when you speak to the farmers, and I have been lucky enough because of my position to go out and to meet about 30 suppliers over the last 3 years, whether that's farming, brewers, we changed all of our rice from Asian rice to European rice. That's a whole different kind of conversation and story. But the wild venison piece, and it has to be wild venison to get the environmental impact. But when you start to take, wild venison off, then nature starts to come back in again. Wild venison are ruminants that just go through and eat their way through. So, not all venison is created equally, so it's like, you have to look at what you're eating. Park venison, farmed venison, you might as well just have cow if you're having farmed venison, really understanding where that's coming from. So that has been a really good nature lever for us. We do monitor that. We've taken our venison consumption from about 1.5% of our meat protein spend last year. It's now sitting at about 9% this time last year. So we've really driven that from going out and being quite public about that kind of like Beef Out, Venison In. We were just recognised recently from the Footprint Awards for that kind of Wild About Venison campaign. So I do see that from an internal perspective, that was really purposeful. That wasn't generally about bringing the emissions down. That was about looking at our kind of, our landscape outside and seeing how we can support the nature build again from a natural predator out there.
And do you think this is hypothetical, I don't know how you would answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think you would have come to that solution had you not engaged with the farmers who are your suppliers?
A bit of a blend, really. So, if you don't know, wild venison, or all venison, comes in two places. It does fit into the health lever as well. So it does help your scope 3. There's, as I said, it didn't, but it does. So it's like, if you look at wild venison versus beef, it's nearly 83% less emissions because there's no input goes into venison. So, you don't have to feed it 3 times a day. You don't have to give it water 3 times a day. If we talk about hydrology is going to be really important in the next 5-6 years. But there is the health lever as well. There's like 0 saturated fat. There's 22 grams of protein per 100 grams. So as we look at our, we are about to launch an internal campaign called Nutritiously Levy through the summer about like raising nutrition in every bite of what we do. So I think it was pared back and picked, Jen, from various different things. It was like from the nature lever, the environmental lever, and from the health lever, which helped us get there. Plus, getting more knowledgeable. You know, this time last year, I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I was on a roundabout down in just outside Swindon, staying in a hotel, and we went down and spent the day with David Hooton, who's the advisor to DEFRA on wild venison. We spent the day, went to Macaroni Estate. It's a 9,000 acre estate. We spent the day with a farmer to understand what the wild venison were doing to his environment, and I spent the day with Eat Wild as well. So we all come together because I needed to be equipped to understand, because I constantly get, oh, we run out of wild venison, you know, can people eat it? You know, it's all this kind of things, and having some really active conversation. So I don't think it was one thing, looking at nature, but it was definitely part of it. So it helps me sit here and even more like that, consolidate and solidify that it's not just environmental levers. As soon as you start pulling one, then actually you're starting to affect the other. That makes me really happy. You know, I'm in a really kind of privileged position to look at these projects and understand how they drive impact within our business.
Thanks, Kevin. So Tim, how can our data, that like everybody's collecting a lot of data, especially for scopes 1, 2, 3, is there some data points that can help us shift that focus, I guess, from the carbon tunnel vision into a more holistic view?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to answer that, but just before, I'm going to say it's 3 different panelists are all united by one common thing, and that's you might have picked up on it, Brentford Football Club. Now, I had to just give them a shout out because they're winning lots of sustainability awards, but also I happen to be a season ticket holder, and so Levy provide the delicious venison burgers at Brentford now. Asahi, I think I'm right in saying, supply the delicious, I'm not a beer drinker, but I'm told delicious beer and lager as well. So I just thought that was quite an interesting commonality there. And it just so happens that as a brand, as a challenger brand, Brentford, who are used, you know, in their own way, they use data to outperform traditional markets. It's quite a nice coming together. Other football clubs are available. I have to say that. So the question was about data.
About data points, ones that will help enable us all to move past just carbon into a more holistic framework, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a great expression, what can't be measured can't be managed. So if you think, we are like the non-financial data layer. So in businesses, you have the kind of financial data, which you guys would probably all switch off if someone started talking about financial data and CFO stuff. And then you have all the non-financial data, which is all of, you know, everything else, particularly related to sustainability. And there's a movement now, we treat non-financial data in the same way, in the same import within businesses and society as we do non-financial data. That gives us much, much richer insight, much, much richer value beyond its original purpose. So a lot of people have to collect data for regulatory reasons, scope 1, 2, 3, etc., etc. But actually, once you're complying with that and you've got those things in motion, what else can be true with this data that you're finding? And we're seeing a lot of customers who are, and linking it back to nature actually as well, where they're doing amazing things in nature, but one of the challenges has often been for customers, and perhaps for you guys as well originally, translating that in a language that the board of your businesses can understand, number one, and number two, will then think, okay, yeah, we'll fund more of that. So I think, in answer to your question, data is super important because it's the enabler for a lot of these other projects to get off the ground, to grow, and to be funded. So I think that's probably a nice circular bit.
Yeah.
Still managing to get Brentford FC into the story as well.
So I guess to help us focus on the right areas, by show of hands, who feels like they're still a bit stuck in carbon, tunnel vision? Nobody, you've all moved on. Oh, one hand. Don't be shy. And who feels like you've got a complete grip with all things nature and you've assessed it and you're reporting on it and you understand it completely? Still nobody. You all have hands though, right? You're just all somewhere in the middle. Okay. Okay, good. We'll carry on. They'll warm up. It'll be fine. Okay, so we touched on Brentford, which I think is a great example of localized system change. And Asahi, as part of the club, have really engaged the fans to bring to life the impact of nature. Tell us a bit about what you're doing with the fans.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, kind of carrying on the hops theme, we do stuff on our other ingredients, but our Fuller's London Pride is the beer partner for Brentford, and through the partnership, we were kind of trying to explore ways that we could collaborate together. And I think when we talk about systems change, kind of us working at the top end of the supply chain with our suppliers is one part of it, but we also need to bring our customers and consumers along the journey with us. And so what I think started out as a kind of fun activation has actually kind of turned, I guess, into a bit of a sustainability project where we've launched this thing called Be a Hop Grower with Pride this year, where we're essentially getting Brentford football fans to grow hop plants at home. We're bringing them together in September to harvest those hops together, and then we'll be launching the beer, the special brew, which we're brewing with the hops that they've grown in the stadium for season ticket holders to drink over the next season. And I think the sustainability angle is really trying to engage these consumers with the things that I was talking about earlier, so trying to help them understand the impact British hops are facing from climate change, that there's only around 45 hop growers left in the country, and trying to connect that through from what we and other brewing companies are doing in the supply chain to the product that they know and love, and the future of that product as well. So both for the people who are involved in sending me WhatsApps every day with pictures of the hop plants that they have in their gardens, to all of the fans who are going to be buying the beer in the stadium next year. So as you said, it's kind of like very local for now, but I think has been really brought together, I guess, a bit like the work we're doing with the Hops PhDs. It's a collaboration, and I think it's something we couldn't have done at all on our own. So collaborating has been really crucial to success, but one where at a small scale we're trying to kind of engage that consumer and bring them along the journey so they can start to understand the risk that we're facing as a result of climate change in ingredient supply chains, and what needs to happen to change that.
Thanks. And Kevin, other important stakeholders for you in achieving that kind of system change? You talked about visiting a lot of farmers and engaging with them. System change often sounds sort of quite big and unwieldy. Have you got some examples for us about how you, I guess, achieve or instigate some system change within your organization?
Yeah, let's talk about it. I think it's, hopefully people find it interesting, is about removals, insetting, offsetting, and everything that we've been told as organizations and businesses we should look at. So I did spend about 3 years ago, a lot of time on this, and constantly went around to the same place. It was like, spend £1 million on trees, but we can't guarantee the trees are going to give you anything back. You know what I mean? And this perpetually thing come around and around again to us. Now, there is some really good organizations doing good stuff and giving credible advice, but due to the lack of legislation and governance around about it, it's a really hard place for any organization to put any amount of money in. We have worked with an academic called Dr. Vincent Walsh for the last 4 years. He's a real kind of friend of the business and a real SME who supports us. And we started a project with him 4 years ago called the BioHub up in just outside Harrogate. It's a 90-acre demonstrating farm that it's a collab between Yorkshire Water, ourselves, and Regen Farm Co, or Regen Future Co, as it's now called. Because, nature is being damaged. I've spent a lot of time up there. I've must have done about 30 sessions up there, and we take over 400 or 500 team members up there on a yearly basis. Slowly but surely over the last 4 years, we have turned it into a demonstrator site where, by design, we've looked at, and it was a 5th generation farm, had 140 sheep on it, and you can see what's happened through the years, through the advice from DEFRA to take out all the hedging, to farm to the walls, and understand, to really understand that land use change. I couldn't get my head around it kind of 5-6 years ago, but really understand what farm use change means and what actually damage that's having to the environment, especially, if we look at the If anybody doesn't know, like the food system accounts for 26% of all emissions. Out of that 26%, 2/3 of it comes back to the livestock and what we grow and the damage that we've done to the environment. So for me, it was looking at where we could make changes, but investing money in the right way. I will come full circle on this. So rather than, and we've done a lot of work with regenerative farmers. You know, we work with Wild Farm to do all of our breads. We work with Glebe Farm oat milk, so they're 100% in our business. These are, and I can give you another 10 examples. These are all good food businesses that we've gone out, understanding what impact we'll have to our business, what they'll have to the landscape, and then bringing them in to our purchasing. But this year, rather than going down offsetting route, you know, that it does get, we are part of Compass Group, Compass UK. They do manage our reporting. You know, that we are signed up to the SBTI framework, or aligned to the SBTI framework in the UK. They take care of reporting. But we did take £500,000 off of our bottom line this year, and we launched our Living System Fund on the 29th of January this year, where we've given £500,000 to 6 UK nature-based projects and charities to demonstrate that we do want to give back to nature. You know, I can give you the 100 levers that we've done in the environmental space, but we do take it very seriously. One of those was Allerdale, 100 mile north of Inverness, for example. We've given them £100,000 towards, it's about regeneration of the wild salmon tracks by planting like trees along the riverbanks to really build up the nature and restore nature. And very quickly, you know, you start to give nature a little bit, or the environment a little bit love and a little bit care, and all of a sudden you see the birds coming back and the trees growing and so on and so forth. Those areas, you know, we've given £25,000 to a seagrass project down in Wales. I was up at North Parks recently, so we've given North Parks £100,000 towards a bugs life project. So it's about the raptors and the bugs. You know, they're now creating a network over the south of like northern parks, across the northern part of it, creating like bug highway. And I'm really proud of that, you know, being able to go to our company and say, can you give us money towards these projects, which isn't ultimately an easy conversation, but actually we all believe it's the right thing to do. It's like, you know, we are part of the problem, hopefully seen as part of the solution through, you know, you can read our impact report and understand what we've done within supply chain and our kind of practical interventions around about some of the switches, you know, plant-based desserts, so on and so forth. But we do take nature very, very seriously as well, and that's one of our big levers this year that we've really kind of brought into play.
And because you used language like you gave these projects the money, is there, and you said it was quite a difficult conversation, like tell us a bit more about that. Is there business case? How do you measure the success of some of those projects in terms of paying back into your business resilience?
Yeah, I mean, they're all seen as no financial return. You know, what we get in return from it is proof that they do it, because we want to see nature build again, and access to the marketing material, which, you know, that makes your company become richer anyway. There is no, sometimes, you know, if we've got sustainability experts in the audience, sometimes, you know, because I come from a commercial role. I started 13 years ago as venue director here. I was a business director across the UK with Levy. I managed, you know, 6 large venues, managing a lot of teams. So I gave up my commercial responsibility 5 years ago, which doesn't have as much leverage in the business at times, but actually, you know, it allows me to cut through that at times within the business. I've become the NGO within the business, because I can go in and talk about, you know, the non-commercial side. As you know, we have also grown our business. If anybody does follow Levy or watch Levy, you know, we'll be mobilising, we are in Brentford, but we'll be mobilising Man United this summer, Liverpool, Lex, RB Leipzig, Hamburg, you know, and that's because clients want to work with companies that have purpose and being not just sitting there and doing nothing. So people always ask that question, Jen, saying what's the financial return? I can't always tell that, but we do know that our clients want to work with companies that have purpose. And our retention rate, as we start, you know, we've done over 8,000 minutes of educational workshops to our teams last year. You know, I was in Berlin last Wednesday, and I was in Dublin last Friday, just as an example of that, where we run 3.5-hour workshops where we talk about environment, what we can do with health, what we can do with nature. And our staff retention rates have gone from 65% to 8 to 7% over the last 5 years, because people want to work with companies that have purpose, but also have a clear plan. And it's not always, making the money is the output of doing a really good job. We don't get it right every day, but as an organization, I'm very proud to say that we are trying on a daily basis.
So it still makes very good business sense all round. So Tim, tell us a bit about, I guess, getting the right data to the different stakeholders, the different parts of the system to sort of enable that change. Has the food sector nailed it? Is there a sector that's better or worse?
That's a good question. I think I'm seeing some really interesting examples in places like Germany, actually, which is where we're HQ'd, where within the supermarkets in Germany now, many of whom are our customers, you can hover a consumer app over a QR code and see the exact provenance of your food. And I think that's a really, really positive step. And consumers are demanding that, right? So that's been a really interesting development. I think when we talk about data and impact, something I'm proud that we are at the forefront of, and actually it's quite topical, because I think there was a news piece that some of you may have heard of, the EU deforestation-free regulation. We were the founding technology partner of the EU Traces system, and basically the intent of this regulation is to reduce and almost eradicate, but certainly significantly reduce deforestation, degradation in places like the Amazon rainforest, the Amazon basin, and other beautiful parts of the world that have been devastated by soy, by cattle, etc. And our technology represents about, well, according to the Traces guys, probably somewhere in the region of 80% of all companies that are using software are using our technology to help with that visibility and that data. But I think then beyond that, the output of that, beyond that, has been that organizations have then had better sort of visibility embedded in their workflows, so it helps them to then surface other important projects that contribute to positive nature and biodiversity impact. And it also helps them to take these projects to board level with this data and insight to then get investment for other projects that they want to continue doing, which I know I mentioned earlier, but that is definitely an outcome we're seeing. So those would be two sort of examples. And the UK is apparently, that was the news, sorry, the UK is apparently, DEFRA are much closer to now rolling it out. Something was announced yesterday that the UK version of EUDR is potentially almost upon us. So that will be very exciting for everybody. And don't worry, we've got you covered. We can solve that.
Okay, good. Just as we run in, I've got a couple of final questions for the panelists. Does anybody have a question to make sure you get it in before we wrap up? Not yet, you're still mulling. Okay. Right, just finally then, thinking about what those key levers or enablers are in achieving impact and achieving that focus, I guess, on nature and resilience. So Kevin, you touched on the funding and sort of how it came to be, but you're also big advocates for sort of innovative solutions. You do a lot of partnerships and things. Do you want to highlight any in particular?
Yeah, I mean, supply chain work has been kind of key to what we're doing. So we're 99% of our emissions sit in scope 3, so we're very, the resilience sits a lot with our supply chain and how we work with them to make the changes as we move through that. So kind of two that kind of come to mind, I suppose, is Nopla packaging. So kind of nature-based packaging. So they're an Earthshot Prize winner back. They were one of the kind of first in the cohort about 5 years ago, and then it doesn't know, so all packaging that you pick up generally has a plastic lining, so a PLA lining or PFAS lining. So where Nopla is, it's seaweed lined. So they take brown seaweed at various parts of the UK and Europe where it grows, and they extrude the film out, and then they cover that onto the paper, and it can be composted, home composted in 6 days. So we have a lot of our clients now, the O2, they were one of the early adopters kind of back 4 years ago. We put Nopla into the O2. They actually just put it through their anaerobic digester that they have. So again, it's not having to go to be burnt. It doesn't have to be put out there, and then there's no kind of fossil fuel having to be created to make it. And it's exactly the same process. For anybody interested in LCAs or life cycle assessment, it's 36% less environmental impact. And you kind of go, so what, I suppose. And I think, but for us, it was one of my 9 levers when I started 4 years ago. It was reduction of single-use plastic, so sauce sachets, all that type of stuff. But consumables, we use 25 million pieces a year in Levy. We've now converted over to 20 million pieces of consumable are now Nopla. So that's how you can really kind of make that change at scale. And I suppose the second one, we moved all of our salmon spend over to trout spend. Now, there's lots of reasons why you would, there's lots of constant bad press, Norway, Scotland, so on and so forth, about this overproduction of farm salmon, and that's, so we currently switched about 150 million tonne of farm salmon now sits within farm trout spends, and that's basically driven from an environmental perspective, but also from a lot of nature. If anybody don't know, when they're given antibiotics to salmon, for example, because we often hear about that, wild salmon get sea lice. That's the problem with them, so they have to give them antibiotic. So the way they give them antibiotic, they don't go along like a cow and give an injection to them, or chickens where they put it into the feed, so we know the drop that it's having as it goes in. With salmon, they just have to scatter it into the ocean, and hopefully the salmon then take that, through there. So all of that's then coming down, and then all that antibiotic is going onto the bottom of the ocean. It's destroying another layer of the underlayer of that. It's just the way that salmon are bred at scale. So there's a lot of environmental damage, so that's obviously hurting nature at the same time, and there's a lot of health implications as well. So, where farm trout is just reared in a very different, it's a fresh water system, so fresh water in, fresh water out. And as a reference point, salmon and trout all live about 3.5 years. So 3 to 3.5 years to grow 3 kilo salmon. It takes a long time for that process to happen. Lives the same length of time as a cow. So we've done a lot of work on that. I'm probably not very articulate on it today, so apologise. But if anybody's got any questions around about it and why we've done that, then happy to kind of chat it through further.
Thanks. And Izzy, you've touched on a couple of your collaborations. Do you pinpoint that as one of your key enablers to progress?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say absolutely. I think, you speaking about your suppliers was also making me think for us, so much of what we can do is actually, I think, both addressing these things with combined objectives across climate, nature and social, and collaborating with others across the ecosystem, whether that's our suppliers, whether that's through academia like the HOPS PhDs that we're doing, or whether that's also, connecting back to our customers, which for us, like you were saying, is, a key part of making the business case for a lot of the work that we do. Is obviously we have targets for things like reducing our emissions, packaging, waste, etc., which we have a roadmap to meet as a business. But I think alongside that, the pressure that we get downstream from our customers is definitely increasing, and it's something that helps continue to make the case to push beyond those targets as well. I think, for example, I talk quite a lot about the HOP stuff, which is, collaboration outside and also downstream with a customer. But at the other end, we've been doing some work with Bort Malt, who are our malt supplier, to help implement regenerative practices on the farms in our supply chain. So we've switched for all of the pale malt we use in our brewery at Griffin. So that's around 90% of the total malt usage to malt that's farmed using regenerative practices like cover cropping, reducing tillage, fertilizer usage, etc. And that's a collaboration which goes all the way up the supply chain. So we buy from Bought Malt, and then they're working with one of their grain suppliers, Future Ecosystem Services, who are working directly with those farmers, so trying to identify farmers who are in the position and have the appetite to make these changes and to help them work through the transition as well year on year. And then I think kind of coming back to the data side, like an important part of that is then connecting to the MRV, so making sure that we can monitor and report and bring that data back to our business. And so I think from a kind of, as I said, for hops, if you look at this from a carbon lens, they're less important, but for malt, for us, that's quite a significant portion of our emissions footprint. I think unlike a food business, it's not all of it. We're quite split between ingredients, packaging, brewing operations, and logistics, if you look at our scope 1, 2, and 3. But it's still a really important part of that supply chain. So making sure that we're taking a baseline for those farms, we're tracking year on year what practices they're implementing, and using that to estimate those reductions is really important. And that's done through Sofitra and Bought Malt, but also with Soil Capital as well. So I think connects back to that systems change part, is trying to kind of work at scale. We're doing this with them on a mass balance basis, so it's not something we can put on our pack and say this is regeneratively farmed, but hopefully goes towards helping push that system to be more resilient, to help us address our climate and nature risk in the future, but also I think is another way we're trying to collaborate across the whole supply chain in order to meet these climate goals and address our risk as a business.
And you've both talked about, resilience. Is there a point in time where you will be able to visibly see that this focus has paid off? Do you think you're a more resilient business than your competitors? Do you have a goal in mind?
That's a tricky question. I'd say...
I promised I wouldn't throw in any curveballs, but I have.
I think it depends a lot on the crop and the relationship and the supply chain, the specific supply chain, and the relationship with the suppliers. So,
and
for
also
example,
having that glass ball to predict the future, right?
Well, I'd say like for barley, if we were doing it on a segregated basis, you would expect that after 3 to 7 years, you'd start to see the impact of those regenerative practices in your supply chain. For us, obviously, we're doing it on a mass balance basis, we buy on an aggregated basis, so it will require effort from all actors to help shift that system. For others, say for apples, we have direct contracts with our apple suppliers, and they're long-term contracts as well. So I think that's an example of where by working with those farmers directly and helping them improve the resilience on farm, we should hope to see those impacts feed into our business in the next 5
Securing
10
the source
years.
for a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Tim, final one for you. You talked a bit about, the language that you use, so financial data and non-financial data being as equally important. Is there any other, tips on how you integrate nature-based data into that boardroom type of discussion and into your regular reporting? Where should people start?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we support a lot of groups, Nature and Biodiversity UK, a lot of nature organisations, and I think being able to at least measure what they're doing is a really valuable start point. And then I think as they have more and more contact with more meaningful data that is showing signs of how it's got some form of return, shall we say, then it is helpful at board level. But I just want to reflect on the rich content of my panelists. I know I never ceasingly amazed at some of the amazing projects that these organisations are doing, and I learned an awful. It's like an education every time, but learned an awful lot. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but that a cow, a trout, and a salmon both live for about 3.5 years. Also, I was pondering, reflecting on something you said, that apparently high society Norwegians don't eat wild salmon because of that lice factor. They wouldn't eat it as sushi, for example. Maybe they know something we don't, but no. But in all seriousness, I think the topics here have just been really, really exciting to know we're in great hands in this country as we have to adapt and show resilience to clearly climate changing as evidenced today.
Thanks, Tim. Right, this is my final call for questions before we wrap up. Not a single one. You've just covered everything, guys. Oh, sorry. Can I have a couple of rules? Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Hi. Really interesting discussion. Last year there was a sort of open letter published by I think a group called the Insiders Group, which is a group of sort of senior executives in the food industry from supermarket chains and others, talking about the impending crisis of the global food supply chain, particularly the UK food supply chain. It got a bit of a ripple of attention at the time. FT even published an article on it, I think. But then it's sort of all sort of gone away again as the news just continues to cycle around and something else comes up and Trump does something else, so we get diverted. But do you think, in general, we're massively underestimating the risk that the food supply chain in this country faces? And you've given some great examples today of the work that you guys are doing, but more broadly, one of my clients is a private equity fund who invest in food companies from time to time, and the executives in those companies, those sort of medium, mid-market companies, really aren't talking about the impact that climate change is going to have, and really aren't doing anything of the sort of projects initiatives that you guys are working on. So, I just wondered your opinions really on kind of, given your colleagues in your space that you must talk to, do you think in general it's really underestimated the risk that we're facing and the challenges that we're facing when it comes to the food supply chain in the UK?
Yes,
Yes.
I think is the answer. Do we wholeheartedly agree yes?
Yes.
So I've met with some of the team who wrote that article, but I also work with all of the UK retailers and a lot of the, businesses from across the different subsectors. And I'm optimistic that a lot of the sector is taking it seriously and taking action. But I also think that the people who are doing it are up against quite a lot of challenges from sort of C-suite level and from suppliers and customers. And there certainly isn't I think where this sits on their agenda fluctuates on a almost daily basis in my experience of how much funding and how much attention and time it can get. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there is a challenge. If you go out and speak to the farmers, I think, the biodiversity challenge, so this like kind of how many years of crops that we have. And I've been out and I've dug like sods of soil and I've seen really bad and I've seen some that's getting a little bit better. And again, it doesn't take long to recover, that kind of from what it looked like 4 years ago to now. But if we don't do anything to it, then that will continue to keep on degrade. Like every time we take a carrot out of it, the carrot takes the nutrient and we keep on pulling up. So without actually giving something back to the soil, that will keep on degrading. Hydrology, we mentioned again, is becoming, I went to a talk about 6 months ago, we're getting down to that kind of 4 to 2% of all water now on the earth is drinkable and fresh because of ice cap melt, because of the amount that we've fed to our livestock. Livestock now accounts for close to 26% of that kind of coverage. So it is absolutely going to become a challenge. I don't think it's, I don't think that's a myth. I think it's there if we don't help build resilience and go the right way. I think at Levy, I think we do have our food service has an opportunity over retail because it's the consumer that will help drive that change. So if you go to a retailer currently and try and buy, say, strawberries in November and December or peas, then you'll be able to get that, because if you don't, the retailer is too scared that you'll actually just go next door to the competitor and buy that. Where at Levy, we have been driving the kind of seasonal principles for the last 4 years. We put an air freight ban in place in 2021, so you can't buy none of our team can buy strawberries in November or December or peas. They have to go from like a strawberry cheesecake to an apple cheesecake or an apple panna cotta, that type of stuff. So we are facilitating where we drive behaviors and looking at a lot more direct consumer purchasing, but it is a balance, like if the consumer wants it, then that's what we have, and it's really hard to push against that from a kind of education perspective. But it is, and this is just an emotional piece, because Jen will probably ask me what kind of worries me. Like, I'm a 50-odd-year-old man who I feel has been given an opportunity to give a bit purpose and to give a bit drive to a food. I've worked in food and drink for over 35 years. I absolutely love it. It's where my passion is. But that kind of behind us, that kind of future generations, it's over 40 degrees, you know what I mean? It's like the highest days. We had that last month as well. It was 37 degrees in June. We've never had that. I was woken up this morning to the loudest thunderstorms that I've had in a long time. So that's the stuff that scares me and should scare us to make a difference. I'm not here to scaremonger. I'm just we all have an opportunity to get on this and kind of push forward together, and hopefully change lasts, and kind of becomes embedded for a bit longer than I
That's
should have.
okay. I'm being given notice of time, so I'm going to come back to you guys for a final comment in a second. My final plug is going to be, if you are a food and drink business and you have not yet mapped your water risk, then please have a look at WRAP's water roadmap, which will help you do that and help you take action in some of the thanks, in some of the highest risk areas, because I think our choice will be limited and we will not be able to get strawberries over winter soon enough if we don't tackle those high risk areas. So starting from Kevin, why don't you pick this up again? Final thought. Maybe let's try for optimistic. What's your top tip to take away for the audience to take away today?
I think it's genuinely getting on with it. You mentioned the kind of C-suite piece. It's trying to see through that barrier. We can all take action on our own. We can't always say the barrier is someone else, and I know that's much easier said than actually done. But you have to be action driven. If there is any of those kind of senior decision makers here, it's about getting on with it. Let the kind of data catch up, let the bits and pieces catch up. You will genuinely feel good about that, and I think you will start to see that shoot come through sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Izzy, top tip?
I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Well, that's reassuring, I think. Right?
Which was just get started. I think for us, it's, maybe also just get out there and talk to people, because I feel like a lot of the projects and the work that we've done has come from, talking to others across our supply chain, finding those who have similar values and interests, and projects have kind of grown out of those organically. And we haven't always had all of the right things ready to start with. We haven't always had the perfect measurement framework from the beginning, but that's something that we've developed along the way while we've been going, and the sooner that we can all start acting, the better, really.
Lovely. Tim, you're looking very pensive. What's your final top tip?
I think get started, but when you want to be able to surface the data to kind of help evidence your story further up the value chain in organizations, then technology partners can help with that. Technology has a place to support that, and accelerate it. So yeah.
Lovely. I think I'm out of time. Nobody's going to kick us off quite yet. Anybody want a final question? Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Right in the middle.
Get that lady with the microphone running. Hello.
Oh, sorry, maybe I wasn't supposed to do that.
And that
Mike,
question
move it
is
away.
for Asahi.
The pressure.
I know.
Great talk, and it's really cool to hear what the two companies on stage in the corporate world are doing. I'm interested, how are you, because so much information's been shared across the course of the hour, what are you doing to bring the people who work in the company along with you? How are you engaging them? What role do you see employees having when everyone's stretched for time? How do you make time for it, and how do you make them take action?
Big stick? No?
Definitely not a big stick. So 2 parts. How we drive culture is the education that we give our teams. I started 4 years ago as an operator. I wasn't a sustainability lead, so we had to start to create a plan that was very clear, simple, and kind of relatable. We've got like a workforce of like chefs, like kitchen cleaners, like table servers, commercial teams. So we created, back in Edgbaston, it was the first one, June 2022, we brought 500 people together. And that was, if I look back, I still look back at the slides that we presented then, but that was the kind of start of the journey. And every year since then, we have our own in-house education program. So it's, we run our sustainability workshops, as I said. I've done 2 of them alone last week. I know Susie was out doing 4. So we deliver that to every venue yearly. And it's really simple. We talk about scope 3 once, and we talk about LCAs once. The rest of it is all about, the reason why we should be doing it. We do a little bit carbon literacy. Companies shouldn't waste so if there's any carbon literacy people here, shouldn't waste hours and hours off your expense in there. Actually, you need to educate the people about the changes that you want to do in your business and why they should do them. So we run that. We do an in-house review process where every year we'll sit down with every venue and create a 140-point plan. So that just helps people working together with, like myself and my team, to understand where their hotspots are, where their challenges, how they can move through. And then I think the biggest part was accountability of that. So if they didn't understand it from an education piece, all contracted bonuses in Levy for the last 4 years, 20% of their bonuses make up their overall performance score. So it's not just about the metric of turnover and profit. Actually, what did you do? And it's things like, did you measure your waste? How did you score on your review? Have you done the switches that we asked you to do? And we hold accountability into there as well. So that's how, keeping it really simple and holding accountability.
We're gonna get pulled off now. Is it one word?
Very similar approach. I think looking at the different levels and how we engage with each. So whether that's how we engage with our board, how we engage with those who are directly involved and engaged in sustainability action in the business, and then how we engage with everyone else. I think it's a kind of tailored approach depending on the audience. So for everyone else, that's making sure they're aware of our targets, what are our priorities as a business, and regularly updating them when we have new projects. And then I think for those who are directly involved in sustainability, helping them really understand what their role is, what they need to do, and how that feeds into the overall objective.
So can you please join me in thanking my wonderful panelists and for sharing all of their wisdom.